Hi, everybody. My name is Katie Block. We're pleased that you could join us all for this week's lecture in Volume 6 of our No Neuropsychology series. I'm going to share my slides here and get us started. Okay. This is a didactic series that brings you lectures from experts in the field covering different topics each week. This series was created by trainees and early career neuropsychologists to provide free, high-quality didactic opportunities. Here's our committee and our rotating committee. And you can also find us now on YouTube. If you go to YouTube and find our channel, you can click subscribe and get access to all the content. Typically, we release talks about a week after they're recorded, and you can find them all online. We've also added some learning questions in cooperation with Appson, so feel free to locate those online on our website. And just a few disclaimers before we get started. So these talks are not meant to replace formal education in neuropsychology, and the views of the speakers are their own. Questions can be submitted via the Q&A box at the lower left-hand corner of your screen, and a recording of today's lectures will be provided on our website probably later this week. So first up, we have Isabel Solis, and Isabel completed her BS and MS in psychology at the University of New Mexico. She's Spanish bilingual and a first-generation college graduate. She's currently completing her pre-doctoral internship at the University of Washington. Clinically, Isabel is interested in the utility of neuropsychological assessments and interventions using evidence-based practices with bilingual and ethnically diverse populations across the lifespan. Her research utilizes multimodal methods to examine mechanisms of typical and atypical neurodevelopment as it relates to adverse childhood experiences, including bullying victimization. We're also featuring today Dr. Lynette Abrams-Silva. She's a board-certified neuropsychologist and current director of the Psychology Department Clinic at the University of New Mexico. She oversees clinical training experiences of graduate students as well as teaching several core and elective classes through the Psychology Department. Dr. Abrams-Silva also provides comprehensive clinical and forensic neuropsychological evaluations for adults in private practice in Albuquerque. Dr. Abrams-Silva earned her doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of New Mexico and completed her pre-doctoral internship and 2-year postdoctoral fellowship in Chicago at the University of Chicago and University of Illinois at Chicago, respectively. She's current chair of the SCN's Ethnic and Minority Affairs Committee, through which she continues to pursue mentorship opportunities for developing neuropsychologists. So we're very pleased to have both of these speakers today, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Abrams-Silva.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. And 2.5 years of COVID, and I finally do this smoothly. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to be discussing developing collaborative supervision with trainees of color. Most of my notation is going to say BIPOC, though I find that conversationally a bit cumbersome, so I may continue with trainees of color. I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're doing today because it's a little bit different. I want to provide a little bit of a brief history of my own because I was a trainee of color myself in the mid-2010s, and I had to learn how to supervise. So that's some information for you as background. I'm going to present some of the established models of supervision, particularly the ones that have been noted to be a good fit for neuropsychology, and some information that I have gathered from the EMA mentorship program that we have had going on for a while now. And then comes the collaboration part of the collaboration talk, which is actually going to be in real time. I'm going to present what I intended to implement based on this information with Isabel Solis as a graduate student. And we are going to get Isabel's response about all of this and her own experience sort of in real time. I want to mention that I have not shared any of the information in this talk with Isabel and have asked her for her honest, unpracticed response. So I'm very grateful she is here and willing to do this with me. And then we will return for some final thoughts, a little bit of advice on what you can do if you're interested, and then we'd like to answer questions. So very briefly, My own experience from the beginning of graduate school to the end of fellowship spanned 2006 to 2014, which seems like it was yesterday, but I'm realizing that 2014 is coming up on a decade ago. However, keep in mind that my own experience was in the 2000s and not in the 1960s or 70s. My very brief timeline. I do want to start before the neuropsychology because I do believe that context is important. And these specific factors from my background are those that most impacted my training experience and trajectory. I am a native New Mexican, and ethnoculturally, I am a Mexican Jew. I am the first to pursue a PhD from either side of my family, and both my mother's side and my father's side of the family come from rural New Mexico. Albuquerque was the big city. So my background contains less acculturated people, I suppose, and I'm the most acculturated to academia. And that's important because of the way that I sort of stumbled through my training. I began grad school in 2006 and immediately experienced difficulty navigating the system. I became aware of systemic bias in academia, possibly for the first time because I had never been involved in education at that level until that point. And I was often the only person of color in the room. So I found an overwhelming pressure to represent all peoples of color of the world. And I was not prepared for that. I was very lucky, though, to have excellent clinical supervisors for both therapy and for neuropsychology. And recently, a former therapy supervisor said to me, "Trainees usually learn supervision by modeling themselves after their own best supervisors." Throughout graduate school, internship, and fellowship, I have been incredibly fortunate to have had the very best examples of supervision. But none of them were very much like me or had my same background at all. I had one supervisor that shared half of my background, but no one who had a similar background to me in any other way. Aside from that, I never had any specific direct training for supervision. No class, really no specific training other than some supervision of my supervision on fellowship. There was one lecture throughout the span of training that did focus on how to supervise, which was about an hour, and the lecturer communicated a supervision style that was really authoritarian in nature and recommended, when you first begin to work with a trainee, establish authority right away by demanding that the trainee do something and don't explain why. And this sounds, first of all, more like something that happens in prison than in neuropsych education and training. And also, as a person of color myself, and when training trainees of color, I knew that this style would never work for me. So over time, I have learned a bit more about supervision, about the models that we have, and I've been lucky enough to receive a lot of input from our junior colleagues of color regarding what their training needs are and their experiences during that practicum time of training. That's all about my history. I want to talk a little bit about the available models of supervision. And I want to note that this is not an exhaustive list. This is just what has been noted to be true across psychology supervision and then particularly useful for neuropsychology training. Psychology supervision in general has models of training. They're typically based on psychotherapy, which makes sense. We do a lot of research on effective psychotherapy and have developed models of supervision based on that, with these multiple roles that are assumed to be appropriate for the supervisor, including teacher, counselor, and consultant. As neuropsychologists, we are a specialty. So we do require specialty training, and we enjoy established training standards and formal guidelines, We are neuropsychologists and we like standardization. So we have a roadmap by way of the Houston Conference Guidelines that tells us the things that we need to know to attain competence. The triumvirate, Doctors Stuckey, Bush, and Donders in 2010 wrote an article about neuropsychology supervision. And it had this quote, which I found very true for me. Supervisors have typically learned how to supervise through on-the-job training with little supervision training or supervision of supervision. Meanwhile, clinical supervision has been considered a specific competency by APA since 2006. So luckily, we do have some well-described models of supervision that are available to us. And over time, I have been particularly drawn to two of them. The first being the competency-based model, which explicitly identifies the skills, knowledge, and values that form a professional competency and develops learning strategies and evaluation procedures to meet criterion-referenced competence standards in keeping with evidence-based practice. Kind of a mouthful, but very eloquent, and I think fits neuropsychology very well. In this model, the focus tends to be on output, not input. However, in the article that I just referenced from 2010, there is a list of qualities considered of successful supervisors that is worth reviewing. But generally, the focus on the competency-based model is on the output, which could be a good choice for neuropsychology because we have such clearly outlined competencies. And we even have ways to measure them, like the board exam. But how well does this model capture the experience and the outcomes of trainees of color? Specifically, if we use the board exam to measure outcome, are we missing out on some data? For Hispanic neuropsychologists in particular, the answer appears to be yes. This is an article that came out this year that I encourage everyone to read. I think it's a fantastic article, partially because it's germane to what I do in New Mexico. We are a majority minority state with a very large Hispanic population and not very many Hispanic neuropsychologists. It does talk a lot about very nuanced issues and basically, where are our neuropsychologists who are Hispanic and what are they doing and how can we address their needs? I'm not going to go over the whole thing, though, again, I think it's a great read. I just want to cover a couple of points that I think are extremely important when we consider our position as supervisors. There is this question when we're considering outcomes, and if we measure outcome by board exam, the question is, are you board certified? And of the 103 people who responded, 79.4% are not. So we are missing some important data, but we also have some important data. What has prevented you from becoming board certified? And I think if we just look at these top 5 responses, these can be very informative regarding what we can do as supervisors to work to eliminate these barriers. I submit as a minimum, it would be helpful to keep these barriers in mind as we train our supervisees. And there's a lot that we don't know. I mean, the 33.6% of barrier is other. So we don't know what that encompasses, but should we have more information about that? And should we be addressing whatever the other barriers are? Similarly, prohibitive time commitment, feeling that there's insufficient time to prepare for the exam process. Many supervisors have started to incorporate more boards preparation in their training so that this is sort of built in and there isn't this scramble at the end to feel that one must prepare to take the exam when not prepared before. So there are things that we can do in education, training, and supervision that can help address these barriers, but it does help to know what they are. So the competency-based model is well suited to neuropsychology because of how we are structured, and it can be combined with other models, which is also very useful because we're not so sure how well it is currently capturing the outcomes of our trainees of color. There is some evidence that portions of our population are getting stuck at certain points along the way. And this also may impact our outcome data for various populations that we're trying to address. So what can we adjust? If you look up what competencies are and what qualities they should have, they should be specific, they should be measurable, and they should be developmentally appropriate. And luckily, we have a developmental model. This is actually a very, very popular model, and it focuses on the stages of progression. The bumper sticker sort of definition of it is meet them where they are and help them get to where they need to be. To do this, to be developmental with a supervisee, it's important to determine the supervisee's current stage, not just at the beginning, but as they move through the stages from novice to expert. And this will allow us to provide stage-appropriate feedback, support, and scaffolding, and help them traverse the zone of proximal development, which always reminds me of that scene in The Wizard of Oz where they have to get through the poppy fields and they fall asleep. So getting them through the poppy field of training without falling asleep, helping them traverse that region to build competence and professional identity. At each stage, new information and complexity is presented, and this will help to build the critical thinking to develop at the next stage, to get to the next stage, and so on. It sort of builds on itself so that the scaffolding, the feedback, and the support sort of diminishes over time, or at least becomes less in your face over time, so to speak. And it can use something like the Socratic method. And by that, most of what we see as the Socratic method is an evolution of what it was in the past, but the way that we see it is by using previously learned facts, and in our case, that would be something like functional neuroanatomy, to think through a case, formulate hypotheses, and determine the best ways to test them. And the developmental approach helps trainees develop this process rather than just imparting specific information. It really helps to build a way of thinking, which is why it's so popular, in part, I imagine. And again, back to our triumvirate in 2010, this was actually suggested by Dr. Stuckey, Bush, and Donders, the combination of these aspects of established models. They suggested that supervision should be individually tailored to strengths, weaknesses, and traits of the supervisee. And I like to think of traits as not just personality traits, but also useful to consider the entire background, a trainee's background and context as traits, because they are, they form the context through which this person is navigating the world, including training. Should be developmental in nature, per this 2010 article, with increasing challenges and complexity. And this will help promote independence and the development of a professional identity over time. They also suggest that it should be process-based and that we as supervisors should be modeling behavior for trainees. And I have to confess that this particular aspect of supervision is the thing I struggle with the most. Being a person of color myself, I inhabit this environment that was never meant for me. And it has been difficult to model environmentally useful behavior for trainees who are also in an environment that was not created with them in mind. So while I had excellent supervision as a trainee, and they set amazing examples for me, not only can I not necessarily emulate my previous supervisor's styles because we have completely different backgrounds, but also I am not in the same position within this environment as they are. So much of my professional identity is trying to figure out how to navigate where I am at the moment. And that is sometimes just one step or half a step ahead of the trainees I'm trying to help through. So this part has been traditionally very difficult for me. And I often feel like, well, frankly, a big dork. I just sort of emit behavior and hope that it's appropriate and hope that everything else I'm doing makes up for it. But the modeling part, I think it may be difficult for a lot of minoritized cultures and people. So if you find that this is difficult for you, I completely feel it. And I agree that it can be tough in this environment. And it makes me feel like there's something missing. We have competencies, we have ways of teaching them, we have a developmental way of supervising students. Maybe we can model some good behavior. But as useful as all of that is, I still feel like there might be a missing piece. And maybe that missing piece has to do with the interaction of variables that aren't necessarily fully investigated, at least not yet, partially because people of color are woefully underrepresented within the field of neuropsychology, and this is very slow to change. As we look at the salary survey over the years, we are not diversifying fast enough to keep up with the general population. So my factors as a person of color interacting with trainee factors, if they're a person of color, that might be this missing piece that I could use to be a better supervisor. And again, I'm very lucky because I have access to some data. I have been the chair of the Ethnic Minority Affairs Committee of SCN for 2.5 years. And during that time, I have helped support this mentorship program that we have that was started by Michelle Medor. It was her brainchild, so she deserves all of the credit. But we've been keeping it up, and we do collect data from time to time. And I'm not going to present a lot of data, but there are some results that we have had that have influenced how I conceptualize supervision and the needs, particularly of trainees of color. So I'm going to present just a couple of those details. First, we had 57 pairs. We have mentors and mentees that we matched. It gave me a whole new appreciation for the algorithm that we have for internship and fellowship matching, because we all did this by hand. Like 4 of us got together and matched 57 people, 57 pairs of people. The pairs were, all of the mentees were trainees or early career neuropsychologists of color. And the mentors were overwhelmingly mentors of color as well. And we matched them up, we sent them off on their way, and we have followed up at 3 months and at 18 months. And this has given us some really good information. At first, we asked them, do you prefer a time-limited partnership? And I think the answers are really informative. From the mentees, 66% said no, they don't want a time-limited partnership. 20% were uncertain and had no preference. But I think it is noteworthy that only 14% expressed an actual desire to have a time-limited relationship. And this suggests to me that these mentees are not looking to solve a specific problem in general, not intending to traverse one particular region of training, like getting into a good fellowship, but are craving some other type of mentorship that is not limited. And then after 3 months and 18 months, a few of the themes that emerged when we asked mentees, what do you appreciate most about this experience? And they reported some equally interesting details, like they appreciated when mentors engaged additional neuropsychologists, which helped them to broaden their support network. When the mentor advocated for them in some way. Feeling that validation and making goals feel attainable in their interactions, not being discouraged, feeling invested in, like the mentor really wants the mentee to succeed. and the shared experience with other neuropsychologists of a minority ethnic ethnicity or culture, which actually didn't depend on the background match. So not all of the backgrounds were matched to similar backgrounds, but mentees reported that just seeing others of color in the field was very helpful. And this is just a little bit of the data, but it tells a story to me. And what it suggests to me is that our trainees of color desire a community sort of feeling and an investment in them and a community that they can then invest in, and for the longer term. Not just the semester that I'm supervising you or the 2 years that you might be my fellow, but a relationship and a support network that builds a community, which is really useful information when you're trying to implement these models of supervision. So based on all of this, the models that we have and the data that I saw, I had a graduate student named Isabel Solis, who is with us today, and I attempted to put together a training experience and trajectory based on this information that I have just presented. And to begin with, I like the competency-based model. I like combining it with the developmental, and then using the responses from the Ethnic Minority Affairs Committee mentorship program, I added to the teacher counselor consultant model of just basic psychology supervision and added advocate, which is a bit squishy of a term and sounds a little bit legal. And that's not what I mean legal at all. Although I would probably bail out any of my supervisors from jail if they needed me to. Let's hope they don't get arrested. But advocate, I mean in a much more nuanced way, and definitely a professional one. And in those roles, I tried to implement components of all of the things that we've discussed. So starting with the developmental mindset and collaborating, because I did not want to say, here's the training, take it or leave it. We had a conversation, Isabel and I, about where she was at the time, what her career plans were, where she wanted to end up. And we had to make a plan. And this was a little bit challenging because of the limitations of our program, the time crunch, because Isabel was planning to apply for internship, I believe about 6 months after we had this conversation, and it was COVID. So we had a lot of factors that were very challenging to overcome. And I didn't want to be discouraging because I could see that Isabel is exactly the kind of person that we should have as a neuropsychologist. And she wanted to be a pediatric neuropsychologist. I'm an adult neuropsychologist. And like I said, there were a lot of factors, and we had to have a conversation about the challenges and possible solutions. And we had a good discussion about what might be a better plan, which was delay a year for applying for internship, and let's focus on Isabel becoming the best lifespan neuropsychologist we could get her to be. And she has lots of potential, so I was sure that it could happen. And Isabel agreed. She was completely on board. I was completely on board, and we began to work together very closely. For training the competencies, pretty typical, I think, for neuropsych training. She was performing comprehensive neuropsychological evaluations, and she had weekly didactics that I expected her to engage in, fact-finding, functional neuroanatomy lectures, clinical neuropsychology lectures, just every week, something that encompassed about 2 to 3 hours of her weekly time. And then tiered training. I had her engage in training other students that were junior to her, and she was my teaching assistant in the class where we teach the neuropsychology. And I think that was useful because I've always had a theory that you'll never learn anything so well as when you have to teach it to others. And that was my direct involvement in her training. The advocacy part was not as direct. I remained involved with her clinical training to the extent that I made a plan. I proposed certain supervisors to her, and she went and worked with these other supervisors. And I was increasingly not directly involved with her training, but I was always there for support and to find opportunities for her. If there were no opportunities, I would try to make opportunities for her. And that included certain activities like a panel that we were on for APA. I strongly suggested, I don't want to say I made her do anything, but I did strongly suggest that she join us on a panel. And that was by way of, making an opportunity for her to engage and be heard. In the investment and support arena, I continue to be invested and will be, I say, for the rest of her career. I have continued involvement, although again, not directly. I do offer fellowship advice now that she's applying for fellowship. And I've encouraged her to do things that will widen her support network, like go and introduce herself to senior neuropsychologists she's never met at conferences, which she has done, and I'm so pleased. And in every step of the way, embed this idea that board certification is important and helping her get through and not get stuck, so that when we see another article that updates where are our Hispanic neuropsychologists, we can see those numbers move. That was the plan. That is what we did, I think, for about 2 years. How was it received? So I have asked Isabel to be here today for a number of reasons. First, I consider it part of her training to get involved in conferences and talks and committees and organizations. And my job as her supervisor is to encourage strongly her involvement in these activities. Second, as an advocate, I want to create spaces where Isabel can discuss her experience as well as widen her network by introducing her to all of you. And finally, I was hoping she and I could model the collaboration part of supervision in real time by asking for her perspective and feedback in front of the whole world. So let's ask Isabel what her experience has been. I'm going to stop my presentation and turn it over to her.
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me to be part of this and for this opportunity to share my experience. I think it's definitely been a very, it can be difficult at times for myself, and I don't want to speak for all students of color, to share these experiences. We have to balance a lot of things. And so, I just hearing this plan and just everything that you've laid out so beautifully, I think the part that really stands out for me is building a community of support. I think before I started working with Dr. Abram Silva, I really lacked that. And so there was some gaps, and, recognizing that one mentor can't provide everything. And so really the value of creating a broad network and pushing myself to communicate and introduce myself, get out of that comfort zone, to network with people and to really start to feel like I'm coming to the field and I have something to offer and, want to learn. And I think that piece has been really helpful. Going back to that conversation of delaying, for instance, applying for internship, was really difficult at first to hear. I had all of these plans and all of these ideas of how it was going to be, and then realizing like, wow, I really am not prepared, and really trusting her. And I think that was a key part to being able to lay out and really take my time and be competent. I think when you trust your supervisors, you can delay and do, change your life course almost, in the name of like being a competent neuropsychologist, because that's at the end, my goal to have.
Thank you, Isabel. I always encourage Isabel to say what I could have done, and she never does. So I'm gonna give her one last chance in public, in front of everybody. Is there anything I could have done that you would have benefited from that I didn't do?
I think this is an interesting question because, I echo what you say about having great supervisors, and there's different components of supervision that you can get. And I think I was lacking some of that direction, that when I finally was guided by, your experience, that was so helpful. And I think one area that maybe comes up in this talk and other conversations that we have is this idea of like, how are you modeling things that as you navigate this field? And I feel that just speaks to, it can be a difficult place sometimes when we're not have experience in academia. And so I think that's one piece where I feel like you are modeling, like, how do you navigate these conversations and places? And I don't know, that's difficult to, and it's genuine and it's honest, and it's not because I'm put on the spot. But I think it's because we've created this, professional relationship of genuinely caring about where do I want to go and how to best support me. And I think when you trust your supervisor, that, if there was something that I disagree with, that I feel like I am comfortable, and I'm at that point of my studies where I would want to say, hey, this isn't working for me, not just for myself, I also think about students that come after me, like maybe that could be an issue, or there's this difficulty coming up. So I can't say that anything crazy like that comes up for me right now.
Well, thank you, Isabel. I am glad that you can say that if there was something, you would say so. And that's really my goal, is that at this level, because of the developmental thing, to encourage you to be able to say, hey, this thing didn't work for me, or something like to that effect, or, ask my rationale for a thing that I've done, because I have said over and over that you should always have reasons for the things that you do. So I appreciate that. And most of all, I appreciate you showing up today and letting me just throw things at you and responding to them. So thank you, Isabel. I'm sure that there will be questions specifically for you, because you have so much to offer. So I appreciate it. Thank you. I am going to reshare my presentation and continue with the wrap up, so to speak. I know that a lot of you might be thinking, what can I do? And I do get this a lot, and I feel so fortunate to get this question so often of what can I do to help? Especially the question, I know that you're a person of color, Lynette, so you can do all of this and it works for you, but I'm not. What can I do as not a person of color in neuropsychology to address some of these issues? And the truth is, you can do a lot of things. I'm not going to offer you an exhaustive list as usual. I'm going to say there are things that you can do. You can attend talks like this one. Thank you for being here, but also at conferences. And I've noticed in my time in the field that diversity themed talks tend to be scheduled at somewhat inconvenient times, or to conflict with each other. So you have to pick. And I would encourage you to find the talks that have to do with how to supervise, various populations of student, either, from a culturally or ethnically minoritized background, LGBTQ+, any type of supervision talk for a minoritized population. It could be useful, particularly if you are a director of training of some kind for, graduate school, internship, fellowship. Anything where you do have a position where you could not just implement this for yourself, but implement for other supervisors on your team. talks are a great way to learn about new things and specific populations. You can cultivate those qualities. Like I said, the Stuckey, Bush, and Donders article from 2010 has a list of qualities that respondents have reported are the qualities of successful supervisors. Again, not an exhaustive list, but take a look, read the article, see what you think. It can be very useful to think about, we've developed as supervisors, we have developed our professional identity, but we shouldn't just stop developing. Neuropsychology itself, it lends itself to lifelong curiosity and development. So see what those look like to you, and if there are ways that you can cultivate those qualities, that could also be helpful. I encourage you to consider the context of everyone you supervise. You can ask. you can ask as you build a relationship. I often have said to Isabel, and it's true, we have very similar backgrounds, but we can't assume homogeneity among all Hispanic peoples of the world. So I have said, I don't know what your financial situation is, but for me, it was this. And you can do that. You can ask, gently questions about what factors are impacting them that might not have impacted you. And you can discuss those. There is another article that I'm going to put the reference up on for that has indicated that trainees really do appreciate it when issues of social justice are discussed between them and their supervisors, ignoring the issues out in the world, and there are so many out in the world, it cuts us off as neuropsychologists from our own context. So discussing your context, your trainees' context, the world, what is impacting them. You can avoid assuming things just by discussing. I really encourage you to do that. Once you have a position where you have some control over what's going on around you, you can recruit and retain diverse supervisors. We don't have enough, as I said, just in general, people of color are very underrepresented in the field of neuropsychology, leaving those of us of color who are established lots of work. Most of the diversity work seems to fall on neuropsychologists of color, and we need more, and we need people to be more involved. So encouraging your institutions to diversify in who is hired, and really making the effort to retain people who represent different backgrounds, who are able to supervise. That's a really good plan for the future. And you can also recruit resources for your trainees. Broadening your trainee support network seems to be a really important thing to do when you have someone from a minoritized background in particular. You can recommend these very specific mentorship programs. There are many popping up all over the place, or you can email me. I know I just said that the onus is often on our neuropsychologists of color to do this work, but I feel that, and I am here for you. So if you have a trainee who is in need of any sort of broadening of their network, I'm here for that. You can follow the literature. Like I said, I'm going to put up a couple of references. More and more is being written about these issues all the time. And what I like about the way that the literature is presented in the most recent years is it does seem to give a voice to the voiceless, to those of us who have not necessarily been able to say, this has been my experience. Now we are starting to ask questions in a research sort of way and present it in literature to actually examine it. And following as this literature unfolds is going to be very useful, I think, for all of us. And this is just some of the stuff that you can do for a better, more competent, more diverse, more inclusive neuropsychology. The references I was talking about, 3 in particular, I don't want to deluge you with a whole reference list, but these 3 articles in particular contain information that have been very influential in my own development as a supervisor, and I think they're good reads and everyone can benefit from reading them. And that's all I have to present to you, but I really invite all of the questions that you have. I really do appreciate being able to answer questions, especially along with Isabel, who, like I said, has a lot to offer. So I don't know what happens next, but I'm ready for questions, and I'm sure Isabel is too.
I can help moderate. Well, first of all, thank you both for that incredibly informative and engaging talk. I know I learned a thing or two, and I supervise trainees myself, so I've got some great stuff to take away, I think, and hopefully our other attendees do as well. We did get a few questions back channel that I think were really good questions. One of them you answered already. It was, what can I do when I supervise BIPOC trainees? Probably related to that, one question, you know, Dr. Abram Silva, you talked about that poppy field and getting stuck earlier. What might be some warning signs that you think a trainee is getting a little stuck, and how do you handle that as a supervisor?
That's a great question, because I'm always sort of trying to be hyper aware of when it's happening so it doesn't impact their trajectory too much. I've noticed, particularly my trainees of color, and I have to also give the caveat that most of my trainees are trainees of color, just based on where I'm at in the world. New Mexico's, majority minority state. Most seem to be very hesitant to share their struggles, and this I feel like this is dangerous for everybody, because I can see why. There is really no reason to think that, oh, all trainees of color should be like, I'm struggling. I get it. I was there. Maybe not exactly there, but I do understand. And so I have found that I very blatantly check in. And Isabel is smiling because in the beginning, she wasn't telling me a lot of things. And so I would end up, I don't want to say cornering her, but, just sort of trying to get her in a room and say, how are you doing really? And, saying, I know how hard this is. And I suspect that there are struggles that you're not necessarily sharing with me. And I can help you if you tell me details about that. It works for me because, as I've said a million times, I have all this Mexican Jewish mothering energy that has nowhere to go. So I do tend to be a little bit more direct about things like that, wear a sweater, eat, and tell me when you're struggling. And I know that doesn't work for everyone. It's not comfortable for everyone. But finding the way that works for you to check in frequently with your trainees, and knowing that, there are certain points of time that are going to be really stressful. If you have a trainee that is planning to apply for internship and you haven't received a list of where they're planning to apply, then, follow up with them and check in and make sure that they're not feeling overwhelmed and that that's going to impact their timeline. Which, I mean, it's a long way of saying, like, check in often and use your own style in that way to build that relationship where trainees will feel comfortable telling you, I'm struggling.
I agree. Isabel, do you have anything to add to that from the trainee perspective?
Yeah, I think from a training perspective, again, it's a struggle sometimes to share, that you are struggling. And so when a supervisor shows that genuine, care of saying, hey, how can I help? And balancing, how much you want to share, right? Not to say that you say everything that you're like maybe personally going through, but any way that you can have them support one piece of that, or, being able to share, how academically they can help you move on or get unstuck, whatever that is.
Thank you. We got another really great question. And I didn't even think of this, but it's a fantastic question, especially for today. The question is, as a trainee, what do you do if your supervisor is measuring your competencies from an individualist perspective and you come from a traditionally collectivistic culture?
That's really hard. and I think it's getting better, but there are very established ways of doing things that we might not necessarily be able to change. And this is where broadening your network of support can be really useful, because plenty of people who have made it this far as people of color have been through something similar. And even if we can't say, here's how to fix it, because probably we won't be able to tell you how to fix it, but we can offer support, we can help get you through, because that's, I mean, you don't want to get stuck there. That's a bad outcome for everyone. So finding the people who can support you through it. Sometimes you can have conversations and bring it up. I always recommend having that conversation and saying, here's my context. I think it'd be useful for you to know my context as my supervisor. And this is how I conceptualize what you're telling me. And it's a cross-cultural experience for me to conceptualize it the way that you're teaching it. And that's hard and scary and maybe not possible for everyone. It's a good way to start the conversation. But in the end, if there's nothing you can do and you're just at an impasse, that is why these mentorship programs have popped up. Why I personally have just said, send people to me and I will talk to them. This way of building this community that can help people get through, even when you can't change the situation.
Absolutely. And I think as a supervisor for trainees, I know I was writing a letter of recommendation for somebody today and writing about interpersonal qualities in that letter of recommendation. And, this makes me very mindful of the person that I'm writing about and some of the traditional qualities that one would think of, like this person takes a lot of initiative, or they do X, Y, or Z, but trying to keep in mind the lens from the culture which that person comes from. There may be different value placed on these different qualities. So I think for supervisors, we need to be very mindful about that.
Absolutely. And I think once we start to change the system of how we evaluate people, that will be helpful. And I've often run into the situation where there are trainees that are like, just burn the whole thing down and start over. And that's not a bad idea, except that we don't have anything in place to replace the current system. Mm-hmm. So we sort of have to work within and change it. And it's frustrating and it's not fair. And it is definitely a bias of the system. But not having anything to replace our current system with means that's kind of what we're stuck with. And the more of us that can get together and work together and talk and support each other, the faster that's going to happen.
Absolutely. Another question we had, somebody wanted to know what steps could be taken to make the field more friendly for people of color, especially very early in their career. And they noted as one of those trainees, they do encounter a lot of barriers. And I think this is one that either Dr. Abram-Silva or Isabel could answer. I think both perspectives here have a lot of input.
I think Isabel should answer this for one reason, and that's it's a drop in the bucket, but I created something that I sort of asked Isabel to be involved in weekly. And that she's recently experienced the outside world version of this. So I think that would be a good time to mention.
Definitely. I think getting used to the process and something that, like Dr. Abram-Silva said, has been embedded in our conversations is becoming board certified, and not just talking about it, but she holds fact finding on Fridays, and we have a lunch hour where we get to practice that. And now on the internship, being able to continue that here was very helpful to get experience, and just hearing from others when I got here, like, this isn't really typical, and just feeling very grateful that I had that for quite some time before coming here, that exposure. So I think providing trainees with as much knowledge and not assuming, that we have this background knowledge. I think that can be very hurtful in a relationship with a supervisor if it's just assumed, like, you know this, right? Like, this is the process. This is how you get from A to B to C. And, if we don't come from people that, if we don't have that knowledge as a trainee, it can feel really isolating and So exposing how the process works and exposing to like fact finding, for instance, can be very helpful way to be prepared and, you know, have it like ingrained in you, like this is the natural step, and I've been preparing all along.
Which I think fact finding in particular is a perfect example of where neuropsychology can feel sort of hostile to people of color. I have mentored a lot of people who have found it aversive, and it makes me sad because fact finding is my favorite thing in the world. I think it's the best party trick. I think it's the best drinking game. I love it. I think we should all be doing it all the time, and it really fosters a thought process. But so many people of color have said to me, I'm the only person in the room in group fact finding who's a person of color, and the fact finder is Caucasian and male, and I have to represent all of my people. And if I ask a question or I say the wrong thing, then it reflects poorly on everyone of color. And I see that, I understand. And the one thing I felt like I could do was make a fact finding weekly that was friendly, a friendly arena for people of color, so that it's just me. And I have told you I'm a big dork. I'm the fact finder person most of the time, and it's welcoming and it's supportive. And when you get out and do it in the real world, it might not feel as supportive, but you've done it before so many times that it's not going to feel as aversive as it would have otherwise. And things like that, you know, making spaces that are friendly and supportive to people of color so that they are prepared when it's not as friendly and supportive, I think is a good way to go.
And the last question I had is for Isabel. What advice would you have for trainees coming up behind you?
Oh, good question. I would say the biggest thing I think is, we've said it, you know, number of times, but really find a community. And this really allows you to network, and, you know, it really broadens that support. You can contact or, you know, work with like a postdoc. And so they have recently been through the process and can give you guidance there. You can have support for just like the different types of experiences that we have, you know, from previous students. And the point is just having a big network and people at different levels can be very helpful and can really guide you. And so I think even with Dr. Abram Silva, you know, networking and suggesting like, meet this person, I can also guide undergraduates or master level students trying to get into a PhD program. And so I think you yourself also helping others and getting help. And that way you really get to experience like that model. And for me, at least, sometimes it felt like, oh, I might be inconveniencing that person. And so really getting over that has been helpful. And when I get to help somebody else out who is at an earlier stage, has been great to feel like, okay, yeah, this is, you know, it can be really rewarding. You've gone through similar things. And so I think that's one big arena. And, you know, not being afraid to ask for support, you know, balancing whatever that looks like for you, and finding people that you trust, I think is very important in this process, because sometimes it feels like I don't even know what to ask, you know, or if I ask this thing, is it going to reflect poorly on me that I just don't know something? And so when you find supervisors and people that can mentor you, that you trust, that can change everything.
Absolutely. Well, we are hitting the hour today, and I don't see any other questions. So I'm going to close up today's talk with a great big thank you for both of our speakers. I think I can speak for all of us when we say we really enjoyed this topic and learned something today, and hope to have you back at some point. No neuropsychology.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody.
You.